The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but George Marshall did not notice. He sat at his simple wooden desk in Washington, staring at maps that covered every inch of the wall. Outside, snow fell softly on the streets of the capital. Inside, the weight of the entire world pressed down on his shoulders. It was December 15th, 1941. Just 8 days had passed since Japanese planes had torn through Pearl Harbor like wolves through sheep. The American Pacific Fleet lay in ruins at the bottom of the harbor. More than 2,000 Americans were dead. The nation was in shock, angry and afraid at the same time. Marshall rubbed his tired eyes. He was 59 years old, with gray hair and a face that rarely showed emotion. While other generals wore their chests full of medals and spoke loudly about glory, Marshall wore a simple uniform with almost nothing on it. His office had no pictures of himself, no trophies, no signs of ego. Just maps, papers, and problems that seemed impossible to solve. The phone on his desk rang. It was President Roosevelt. "George, Congress is screaming for action. They want to know our plan. The press is calling us unprepared. What do I tell them?" Marshall's voice was calm, almost cold. "Tell them the truth, Mr. President. We are unprepared. Our army is smaller than Romania's. We have old equipment and untrained men. But we will fix this. Give me 18 months. Roosevelt went quiet for a moment. 18 months? "George, we're at war right now. Which is exactly why we need to think clearly," Marshall replied. "Panic wins no wars. Planning does." After hanging up, Marshall stood and walked to his largest map. It showed the world, and most of it was painted in enemy colors. Nazi Germany controlled almost all of Europe. Hitler's armies were deep inside Russia, pushing toward Moscow. In North Africa, German tanks were crushing British forces. In Asia, Japan had swallowed China, Southeast Asia, and was now threatening India and Australia. America stood almost alone. Britain was hanging by a thread. The Soviet Union was bleeding. And America's army? It ranked 18th in the world, behind countries most Americans could not find on a map. Marshall had grown up poor in Pennsylvania. His family had no money for college, so he worked his way through Virginia Military Institute. While rich boys bought their ranks and connections, Marshall earned everything through hard work and brilliant thinking. He never forgot those years of struggle. They taught him that real strength comes not from what you show, but from what you plan. Now, as Chief of Staff of the United States Army, he faced the greatest challenge in American history. He needed to build a force of 8 million soldiers from almost nothing. He needed weapons, ships, planes, and tanks that did not exist yet. He needed to train farm boys and factory workers to fight the most experienced armies in the world. And he needed to do all of this while fighting enemies on 2 sides of the planet. His secretary knocked on the door. "General, you have been here for 16 hours. Perhaps you should go home to Mrs. Marshall?" Marshall looked at the clock. It was past midnight. Catherine would be worried, but she understood. She always understood. "Soon," he said quietly. "I need to finish something first." What Marshall was finishing would change everything. He was creating a list, writing down names of officers from memory. Not the famous ones, not the ones with political connections. He was writing names of men he had watched over the years, men who showed something special. Intelligence, courage, the ability to make hard decisions. One name he wrote was Dwight Eisenhower, a lieutenant colonel most people had never heard of. Marshall had watched this man during training exercises and saw something rare. Eisenhower could see the big picture while managing tiny details. He could make other people work together instead of fighting each other. Marshall would promote Eisenhower over 366 officers who were senior to him. People would call Marshall crazy for this. But Marshall knew something others did not. This war would not be won by the loudest general or the most decorated soldier. It would be won by careful planning, by logistics, by thinking 5 years ahead instead of 5 minutes. While Marshall worked in Washington, far across the ocean in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was also awake late at night. He stood in his war room, looking at his own maps. His generals celebrated around him. They had crushed Poland in weeks. They had defeated France in days. They had driven the British back across the English Channel. The mighty German Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, but Hitler was reading a report that made him pause. His intelligence service had sent information about the American military leadership. Most of the names meant nothing to him. American generals were untested, soft, used to peace. Then he saw one name with a note attached: General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff. Warning: this officer shows unusual strategic thinking. Recommend close monitoring. Hitler stared at the name. Marshal. He had never heard of him before. But something in the report bothered him. This marshal had reorganized the entire American army structure in just 2 years. He was selecting unknown officers for major commands based on ability, not politics. He was building training camps across America at incredible speed. Hitler called his intelligence chief. Find out everything about this George Marshall. I want to know how he thinks. Back in Washington, Marshall finally put down his pen. His plan was ready. It was so ambitious that his own generals would call it impossible. He would create the largest military force America had ever seen. He would train them faster and better than anyone thought possible. And he would coordinate a global war across 2 oceans and 6 continents. But the most important part of his plan was secret, even from most of his own staff. Marshall was not just planning to win the war. He was planning what would come after. Because he understood something that Hitler never would. Winning the war was only half the battle. Winning the peace would be even harder. As he finally turned off his office light and headed home to Catherine, Marshall did not know that a German spy working in the War Department had already photographed his desk. Those photographs were on their way to Berlin. Hitler would soon realize that America had found something more dangerous than any weapon. They had found a leader who thought like a chess master, seeing 20 moves ahead, while others saw only 2. That the real battle between Marshall and Hitler had already begun. And neither man knew yet that this quiet general from Pennsylvania would haunt the Führer's nightmares until the very end. The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Hitler's chief of intelligence, Wilhelm Canaris, entered the war room carrying a thick folder. It was March 1942, and the news from all fronts was good for Germany. Wehrmacht soldiers were deep in Russia, pushing toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps was making the British run. U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be built. Hitler's generals stood around the map table, moving pins and markers that showed their armies advancing everywhere. They laughed and joked. Victory seemed certain. The Third Reich would rule for 1,000 years, just as Hitler had promised. But Hitler was not laughing. He sat in his chair, reading the folder Canaris had brought. The folder was marked Marshal George C. United States Army. Mein Führer, one general said cheerfully. The Americans are in chaos. They have lost their Pacific Fleet. They are not ready for war. By the time they organize themselves, we will have already won. Hitler did not look up from the folder. He read page after page, his face growing darker. Finally, he slammed the folder on the table so hard that everyone went silent. Fools, Hitler said quietly, which was somehow more frightening than when he shouted. You celebrate too early. This man, he tapped the folder. This George Marshall is more dangerous than you understand. The generals looked at each other, confused. They had never heard of George Marshall. Hitler stood and walked to the map of the United States. Tell them, Canaris. Tell these idiots what you found. Canaris cleared his throat nervously. We have been monitoring American military development. This General Marshall has done something extraordinary. In just 4 months since Pearl Harbor, he has created 35 training camps across America. He is building factories at a rate we did not think possible. He has a plan to create an army of 8 million soldiers. One general laughed. 8 million? From where? American boys are soft. They have never seen real war. That is what we thought about the Russians, Hitler said coldly. Now our soldiers freeze in Russian snow while fighting farmers who refuse to quit. Do not underestimate an enemy just because they seem weak. Hitler opened the folder again and pulled out a photograph. It showed Marshall's desk, covered with papers and plans. German intelligence had paid a cleaning woman in the Pentagon to photograph everything she could. Look at this, Hitler said, pointing at the papers. Marshall is not just building an army. He is thinking about how to supply it, how to move it across oceans, how to coordinate attacks on multiple fronts at once. He thinks like an engineer, not like a soldier. And that makes him deadly. Across the Atlantic Ocean, Marshall sat in a meeting with factory owners from Detroit. His voice was firm and left no room for argument. I need tanks. Thousands of tanks. I need them in 18 months. You tell me it cannot be done. I am telling you it must be done. One factory owner spoke up. General, we make cars, not tanks. We would have to rebuild our entire factories. The cost would be enormous. Marshall leaned forward. What is the cost of losing this war? What is the cost when German tanks roll through American cities because we were too slow to act? I am not asking you. I am telling you. This is happening. His reputation for brutal honesty was famous in Washington. While other generals told politicians what they wanted to hear, Marshall told them the truth even when it hurt. President Roosevelt sometimes flinched when Marshall spoke, but he trusted him completely because of this honesty. Marshall never smiled in meetings, never made jokes, never wasted time with small talk. Some people thought he was cold, without feelings, but those close to him knew the truth. Every night, Marshall read reports of soldiers killed in training accidents. Every week, he personally wrote letters to their families. He kept a black notebook where he wrote notes about every promising officer he met. He remembered their names, their strengths, their weaknesses. His wife, Catherine, watched him work himself to exhaustion. She would find him asleep at his desk at 3 in the morning, papers stuck to his face. She brought him food he did not eat. She tried to make him rest, but he could not rest. Not while boys were dying, not while the world was burning. Meanwhile, Marshall was making decisions that shocked everyone. He promoted a colonel named Dwight Eisenhower to major general, jumping him over hundreds of more senior officers. People said Marshall was crazy. Eisenhower had never commanded troops in combat. He was a staff officer, a planner, but Marshall saw what others missed. Eisenhower had a rare gift. He could make British and American generals work together instead of fighting each other. He could solve political problems and military problems at the same time. In this war, that ability would be more valuable than 100 brave soldiers. Marshall also did something else that made Hitler nervous. He refused to fight the war Hitler expected. Hitler thought America would rush into battle, angry and disorganized after Pearl Harbor. Instead, Marshall slowed everything down. He spent months training soldiers while Stalin and Churchill screamed at him to attack. "We attack when we are ready," Marshall said firmly. Not one day before. "I will not waste American lives to make politicians feel better." Back in Berlin, Hitler received more reports about Marshall. The American general was working 20 hours a day. He had created something called the Army Specialized Training Program, turning colleges into military schools overnight. He was coordinating with scientists on secret weapons projects. He was building a supply chain that stretched across the entire world. Hitler called his top military minds together. This Marshall is building something we have never seen before. Not just an army, a system, a machine that can fight and supply and replace losses faster than we can create them. One of his generals asked, "Should we try to assassinate him?" Hitler shook his head slowly. "No. If we kill him, they will just make him a martyr, and someone else will follow his plans. The damage is already done. He has created something that will survive without him. That is the mark of true genius." Hitler began having nightmares about factories. In his dreams, he saw endless American assembly lines creating tanks, planes, and ships. Faster and faster, never stopping. He would wake up sweating, thinking about this quiet American general he had never met. Marshall knew none of this. He was too busy to care what Hitler thought. His stepson Alan had joined the army and was training for combat. Marshall could have kept Alan safe with a desk job, but he refused. No special treatment for family. If he was sending other people's sons to war, his son would go too. Catherine cried when Alan left. Marshall held her hand, but said nothing. There were no words for that kind of fear. To BY summer of 1942, Marshall's machine was starting to work. American factories were producing weapons at rates that seemed impossible. Training camps were turning out soldiers who were not as experienced as Germans, but were well supplied and well organized. And Marshall was planning something big, something that would change everything. In Berlin, Hitler stared at his maps and wondered where Marshall would strike first. Africa? Europe? The Pacific? The uncertainty ate at him. For the first time since the war began, Adolf Hitler felt afraid. The room fell silent when Marshall walked in. It was June 1943, and the biggest meeting of the war was taking place in Washington. British generals sat on one side of the table, American generals on the other. Maps of Europe covered the walls. Everyone was arguing, voices getting louder and angrier. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, was there with his military chiefs. They wanted to attack Italy, which they called the soft underbelly of Europe. The British had already been fighting for 4 years and were exhausted. They wanted a safer, slower strategy, Marshall listened to everyone argue for 3 hours without saying a word. He just sat there, watching, thinking. His face showed nothing. Finally, when Churchill finished a long speech about why invading France was too dangerous, Marshall stood up. The room went quiet instantly. "Gentlemen," Marshall said in his calm, cold voice, "we are wasting time. Every day we delay, more Russians die fighting Germans. Every day we wait, Hitler gets stronger in France. We made a promise to Stalin that we would open a second front. We will keep that promise." Churchill started to argue, but Marshall raised his hand. It was a simple gesture, but something in it made even Churchill stop talking. "We will invade France across the English Channel," Marshall continued. "Not because it is easy, not because it is safe, but because it is the fastest way to end this war. We will call it Operation Overlord, and we will do it in 1 year." The British generals exploded with objections. "Impossible," they said. "The Germans have had 4 years to build defenses on the French coast. They have the Atlantic Wall with massive guns and concrete bunkers. The English Channel is a death trap. The invasion would fail and waste thousands of lives." Marshall let them talk. Then he walked to the map of France and pointed at a region called Normandy. "You are right. The Germans expect us at Calais. It is the shortest crossing. That is exactly why we will not go there. We will land here, at Normandy, where they think we cannot land. And before we land, we will make Hitler believe we are still coming at Calais." One British general asked, "How will you make Hitler believe that?" Marshall smiled for the first time in the meeting. It was not a warm smile. "I have my ways." What the generals did not know was that Marshall had already started the greatest deception in military history. He had created fake armies with inflatable tanks and wooden planes. He had fake radio communications talking about invasion plans at Calais. He had double agents feeding false information to German intelligence. Across the ocean in his bunker in Germany, Hitler was studying reports about Allied invasion plans. His intelligence service reported that the Allies were building up massive forces across from Calais. General Patton, the most aggressive American general, was commanding this force. The attack would come at Calais. Hitler was sure of it. He ordered his best divisions to defend Calais. He placed his strongest troops and most powerful weapons there. He was so convinced that even when his own generals suggested defending Normandy better, Hitler refused. "Normandy is a diversion," Hitler said. "Marshall is too smart to attack there. He will hit us at Calais with everything he has. That is where we will destroy the Allied invasion." Hitler was wrong, and that mistake would cost him everything. Back in Washington, Marshall worked through another night. He was managing a global war from his simple office. In the Pacific, American forces were slowly pushing back the Japanese, island by island. In North Africa, Rommel had finally been defeated. In Italy, Allied forces were climbing up the mountainous country, though progress was slow just as Marshall had predicted, but the real war would be won or lost in France. Marshall knew this. Hitler knew this. Everyone knew this. The pressure on Marshall was crushing. Stalin sent angry messages demanding the Second Front immediately. His own generals doubted the plan. Congress questioned the cost. And Marshall's stepson Alan was now in Europe, training with the troops who would invade France. Catherine asked him one night, "Can you not transfer Alan to a safer position? Even for my peace of mind." Marshall's face was stone. "I cannot. If I keep my son safe while other mothers lose theirs, how can I look at those mothers? Alan goes where every other soldier goes." She knew better than to argue, but she cried herself to sleep many nights while Marshall worked at his desk, writing orders that would decide the fate of nations. Marshall had one more critical decision to make. Who would command the invasion? Everyone assumed it would be Marshall himself. He had planned everything. He deserved the glory of leading the attack. President Roosevelt called him to the White House. "George, I need you to stay here in Washington. You are the only one who can coordinate everything. If you go to Europe, who will manage the Pacific? Who will handle production? Who will keep Stalin happy?" Marshall nodded slowly. He had expected this. "I will recommend General Eisenhower for command of Operation Overlord." This decision showed Marshall's true character. He gave up the greatest military command in history, the chance to lead the liberation of Europe, the glory that every general dreamed of. He gave it to Eisenhower, a man he had promoted from nowhere. Why? Because Marshall understood something others did not. This war was too big for one person to run from a battlefield. It needed someone in Washington who could see everything, coordinate everything, make sure supplies reached the right place at the right time. Marshall chose duty over glory. He chose winning over personal fame. This is what made him different from Hitler, who always needed to be the star, the hero, the center of attention. As 1944 began, Marshall's machine was reaching full power. American factories were producing one ship every day, one plane every 5 minutes. Thousands of tanks, millions of bullets, mountains of supplies, all flowing toward Britain. In May 1944, the invasion force was ready. Over 150,000 soldiers would cross the channel on the first day. Thousands of ships would carry them. Thousands of planes would protect them. It was the largest invasion in human history. Eisenhower came to Washington one last time before D-Day. He met Marshall in his office. "Sir," Eisenhower said nervously, "what if it fails? What if we cannot get off the beaches?" Marshall looked at him with his cold gray eyes. "Then you will have done your best. But Ike, let me tell you something. I do not plan for failure. I plan for success. And I have planned every detail of this operation for 2 years. Trust your training. Trust your men. Trust the plan." Eisenhower nodded and left to return to England. Marshall sat alone in his office. He had done everything he could. Now he had to wait. The fate of the world hung on a few hours of battle on French beaches. Hitler waited too, in his bunker, still convinced the real attack would come at Calais, still falling for Marshall's deception. The trap was set. The game was almost over. Marshall had outthought Hitler at every turn. Now came the moment when planning would become reality, when thousands would live or die based on Marshall's decisions. June 6, 1944 was coming, and with it, the beginning of Hitler's end. Dawn broke over the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. The sound of naval guns shook the earth like thunder. Thousands of ships covered the ocean. Planes filled the sky. And American, British, and Canadian soldiers rushed toward the beaches through murderous German fired. In Washington, George Marshall sat at his desk, waiting. He had not slept, could not sleep. Every decision he had made for the past 3 years was being tested on those beaches. If he had been wrong, if his planning had failed, thousands of young men would die for nothing. The first reports came in slowly. The radio operators' voices shook with fear and exhaustion. Heavy resistance at Omaha Beach. Men dying in the water. Bodies floating in the surf. But Utah Beach was secured. British forces were pushing inland. The Canadians were advancing. Marshall listened to every report, his face showing nothing. His staff watched him nervously, trying to read his expression. But Marshall had learned long ago to hide his emotions. Inside, his heart pounded. Outside, he was stoned up. By evening, the news was clear. The invasion had worked. Allied forces were on French soil and would not be pushed back. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been broken. The beginning of the end had started. Marshall allowed himself one moment of relief. Then he went back to work. The invasion was just the beginning. Now came the hard part. Supplying millions of soldiers across an ocean, coordinating advances across France, dealing with arguments between generals who all wanted glory. 2 months later, Paris was liberated. The French people danced in the streets. American and British soldiers were treated as heroes. The world celebrated. Newspapers declared victory was near, but Marshall did not celebrate. He sat in his office reading casualty reports. Thousands dead, tens of thousands wounded, and the war was far from over. Germany was being pushed back, but Hitler refused to surrender. The fighting would get worse before it got better. Then a telegram arrived that made Marshall's hands shake. It was the only time anyone in his office ever saw him lose his composure. Alan Marshall is missing in action. Last seen during fighting near the German border. Status unknown. Catherine rushed to Washington from their home. She found Marshall sitting in his office, staring at the wall. She had never seen him like this. For 3 years he had been made of iron, never showing weakness, never breaking. But this was different. This was his son. "They will find him," Catherine whispered, holding his hand. Marshall said nothing. He just squeezed her hand. They sat together in silence for hours while staff tiptoed around them. But the world did not stop for George Marshall's personal pain. Reports came in that needed his attention. Decisions had to be made. The war continued whether his heart was breaking or not. Marshall forced himself to stand. He kissed Catherine's forehead. "I have work to do. George, you can take a day. Just one day. Men are dying every minute I delay." I cannot stop for my own grief when mothers everywhere are losing their sons because of orders I gave. He went back to his desk and continued working as if nothing had happened. But his staff noticed he looked older somehow, more tired, more human. In Germany, Hitler was losing his mind. His hands shook constantly now. He trusted no one. His generals gave him reports of defeats on all fronts, but Hitler refused to believe them. He raged about traitors and cowards. He drew imaginary armies on maps and ordered them to attack, not knowing these armies no longer existed. But even in his madness, Hitler thought about Marshall. In his lucid moments, between fits of rage, Hitler would say to his closest aides, "Marshall beat us before we knew we were fighting. He won this war in 1942 when he built his production machine. We never had a chance once that machine started running." December 1944 brought Hitler's last desperate gamble. He threw his remaining strong forces into a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge, it would be called. It was Hitler's attempt to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. For a few terrifying days, it looked like Hitler might succeed. German tanks pushed deep into Allied lines. American forces were surrounded and cut off. Some units were destroyed. Panic spread through Allied headquarters. Everyone looked to Marshall. What should they do? Fall back? Change the entire invasion plan? Marshall was on the phone for hours. His voice never changed, never showed doubt. "Hold the line," he ordered. "Eisenhower will handle this. We have reserves. We have supplies. The Germans do not. They cannot sustain this attack. Hold the line." He was right. The German attack ran out of fuel and ammunition within days. American forces held at a town called Bastogne despite being surrounded. General Patton rushed north with his entire army in just 3 days, something everyone said was impossible. The German attack collapsed. It was the last time Germany would attack. From that moment on, they only retreated. Then, in January 1945, news came that made Catherine cry with joy. Alan had been found in a German hospital. He was wounded but alive. Captured during the fighting, he had been recovered when Allied forces overran the hospital. Marshall allowed himself to feel relief for exactly 1 minute. Then he returned to the greatest question of the war: how to end it. By April 1945, Allied armies were approaching Berlin from the west. Soviet armies were approaching from the east. Germany was crushed between two massive forces. Hitler hid in his bunker under Berlin, still drawing imaginary plans, still ordering armies that no longer existed to defend a Reich that was already dead. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler killed himself in his bunker. Germany surrendered 1 week later. Europe was free. The Nazi nightmare was over. The world celebrated victory in Europe. Millions cheered. Soldiers came home. Mothers hugged their sons. It was the happiest day since the war began. Marshall sat in his office and cried. Not tears of joy, tears of exhaustion and grief for all the young men who would never come home. He thought of every letter he had written to grieving families, every casualty report he had read, every decision that had cost lives. Catherine found him there and held him while he cried. For 3 years, he had been strong for everyone else. Now, for a moment, he could be human again, but his work was not finished. The war with Japan still raged in the Pacific, and President Truman, who had become president after Roosevelt died, needed Marshall's advice on a terrible new weapon that could end the war instantly. The atomic bomb was ready. The question was simple but horrible. Should they use it? Marshall would have to help make the hardest decision of the entire war. A decision that would save millions of lives by taking hundreds of thousands. A decision that would haunt him forever. Hitler was dead, but Marshall's burden remained. President Truman looked across the desk at George Marshall. Outside the Oval Office window, Washington celebrated victory in Europe. But inside this room, 2 men discussed something that could destroy entire cities in seconds. "George," Truman said quietly, "they tell me this atomic bomb is ready. 1 bomb can destroy an entire city. They say we have 2 bombs. The question is simple. Do we use them on Japan or do we invade?" Marshall sat still for a long moment. He was exhausted. 3.5 years of war had turned his hair completely white. His face had deep lines that were not there in 1941. But his mind was still sharp, still calculating, still seeing problems from every angle. "Mr. President, I have reviewed the invasion plans for Japan. We call it Operation Downfall. Our estimates say we will lose between 500,000 to 1 million American soldiers. The Japanese will fight for every island, every city, every house. They are training women and children to fight with bamboo spears. It will be a massacre on both sides. Truman closed his eyes. And the bomb. The bomb will kill perhaps 100,000 people instantly. Maybe more. Mostly civilians. Women, children, elderly people who never chose this war. Marshall's voice was flat, but you could hear the pain beneath it. But it might convince the Japanese emperor to surrender. It might save millions of lives total, both American and Japanese. Is there no other way? Marshall shook his head slowly. We have been bombing Japanese cities for months with regular bombs. Entire cities burned. Tokyo burned so hot the rivers boiled. Still, they will not surrender. Their military code says death is better than surrender. Only something completely shocking, something they have never seen before, might break their will. Truman stood and walked to the window. If I give this order, history will judge me forever. Some will say I am a monster who killed innocent civilians. They will be right. Yes, sir, Marshall agreed. But some will say you saved millions by ending the war quickly. They will also be right. There is no clean answer here. There is only the choice between terrible and more terrible. Marshall thought about Alan, recovered but damaged by his time as a prisoner. He thought about millions of other sons who would die in an invasion of Japan. He thought about Japanese mothers who would lose their children in the atomic fire. I recommend we use the bomb, Marshall finally said. But I recommend we warn them first. Give them a chance to surrender. If they refuse, then we use it. At least we tried. Truman nodded. Prepare the warning. If they do not surrender, we drop the bomb. The warning was sent. Japan's military leadership ignored it, thinking it was propaganda. They did not believe America had such a weapon. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber called Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The city vanished in light and fire. 70,000 people died instantly. Thousands more would die slowly from radiation. Japan's military still refused to surrender. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. 40,000 more dead. Finally, Emperor Hirohito spoke. For the first time in Japanese history, common people heard their emperor's voice on the radio. He announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. The world celebrated. Soldiers came home. Families reunited. The nightmare that had killed more than 60 million people finally ended. But George Marshall did not celebrate. He sat in his office writing letters. Letters to the families of soldiers who had died in the last days of the war. Letters to Japanese civilians through the Red Cross, offering help to rebuild. Letters to Allied leaders about what came next, because Marshall understood something that Hitler never did. Winning the war was only half the battle. Winning the peace would be even harder. President Truman asked Marshall to stay in government. George, Europe is destroyed. Japan is destroyed. We need to rebuild, or we will just have another war in 20 years. I need you to figure out how. Marshall wanted to retire. He wanted to sit with Catherine and rest for the first time in decades. But duty called one more time that he spent months studying Europe's problems. Millions of refugees. Destroyed cities. Broken economies. Hunger everywhere. And worst of all, hatred between nations that had been fighting for 6 years. Marshall created a plan so radical that many people thought he was crazy. Instead of punishing Germany and Japan, instead of taking revenge, instead of making them pay for the war, Marshall proposed something revolutionary. America would help rebuild them. We will give them money, Marshall explained to shocked congressmen. Billions of dollars. We will help them rebuild their factories, their cities, their economies. Why? A senator demanded. They were our enemies. They killed our boys. Why should we help them? Marshall's answer was simple and brilliant. Because if we leave them in ruins, desperate people will turn to desperate leaders. Another Hitler will rise if we do not help them rebuild properly. We must help them become strong democracies, or we will fight them again in 20 years. This became known as the Marshall Plan. It would rebuild Europe and Japan. It would turn enemies into allies. It would prevent World War I. In 1953, George Marshall won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was the only professional soldier ever to win it. The Norwegian Nobel Committee said he won for creating peace after winning war. Marshall gave a short speech when accepting the prize. He did not talk about his genius or his victories. He talked about the young men who died, the families who suffered, the cost of war. "I have been praised for winning battles," Marshall said quietly. "But the battles I am most proud of are the ones I prevented. The wars that did not happen because we chose to build peace instead of seeking revenge." Now, looking back, we can see why Hitler truly feared George Marshall. Hitler thought war was about destroying enemies. Marshall understood war was about building a better world afterward. Hitler thought leadership meant being the loudest, the most feared, the center of attention. Marshall showed that true leadership meant working quietly, giving credit to others, and choosing duty over glory. Hitler built an empire that collapsed within 12 years. Marshall built a peace that has lasted for 80 years. Germany and Japan, America's enemies in World War II, became its closest allies. The nations that suffered most in the war became peaceful democracies that have not fought major wars since. This was Marshall's real victory. Hitler died alone in a bunker, defeated and afraid, having destroyed his own country. Marshall died in 1959 at home with Catherine, having saved the world twice. Once by winning the war, once by winning the peace. In his final years, reporters asked Marshall about his greatest achievement. He never talked about D-Day or the atomic bomb or the Marshall Plan. Instead, he said, "I tried to do my duty. Nothing more." But history knows the truth. George Marshall was the quiet genius who outthought history's loudest tyrant. He was the planner who saw 20 moves ahead, while others saw only 2. He was the leader who understood that true strength is not domination, but building a better world for everyone. Hitler feared Marshall because Marshall represented everything Hitler was not: humble, thoughtful, building instead of destroying, seeking peace instead of conquest. The Nazi Reich lasted 12 years and left only ruins. Marshall's vision of peace through cooperation has protected the world for nearly a century and continues today. In the end, the quiet general from Pennsylvania did not just defeat Hitler. He made Hitler irrelevant. He built a world where Hitler's kind of thinking could not win. That is why Hitler truly feared George Marshall. And that is why we should remember Marshall not as a warrior, but as a builder of peace. A man who won the war and then won something even harder. He won the peace that followed.